who operated inside the IRA, concludes he committed murder and torture and should be publicly named by the UK government. Unacceptable care and tragic consequences. The head of a national review of maternity care speaks of her shock at the initial findings.
It just cannot continue. There is too much harm, too much distress, too much trauma.
A pioneering gene therapy that means patients with a previously untreatable form of leukemia are now living disease-free. Also today, Ukraine's President Zelensky meets the Pope as the push to reach a peace deal with Russia continues. And the supermodel David Gandy gives us his thoughts on the impact AI will have on his industry. Very good morning to you. We begin with breaking news. The final report into the activities of a British spy who operated deep inside the IRA has found that he committed crimes of the worst possible kind, including torture and murder. The findings published by the Police Service of Northern Ireland in the past few minutes also urges the UK government to publicly name the agent. Well, the man is widely accepted to be Freddie Scappaticci, who was given the codename Stakeknife. He fed information to the British Army during the height of the Troubles. In the 1970s, he joined the IRA and was briefly interned without trial. Towards the end of the decade, he was recruited by the Army's Force Research Unit, becoming its most valued asset, Stakeknife. Throughout the 1980s, Scappaticci operated within the IRA's internal security unit known as the Nutting Squad. Its primary purpose was to identify informers who were then kidnapped, tortured and shot dead. In 1990, the IRA became suspicious of Scappaticci and his unit after the would-be victim, Sandy Lynch, was saved from execution by security forces. The whole unit was then stood down by the IRA. 13 years later, in 2003, Scappaticci was outed by the media as the double agent Stakeknife. He'd been linked to at least 18 murders, all while he was on the state payroll. Some of his victims were fellow agents. Scappaticci died in 2023, having spent the last 20 years of his life in hiding in England. He'd never faced prosecution for any of the 18 murders that he was linked to. Last year's interim report from Operation Kenova, a precursor to today's final report, found Scappaticci's operation as a spy at the heart of the IRA probably cost more lives than he saved. Let's bring in our Ireland correspondent, Stephen Murphy, who's in Belfast. Stephen, just tell us more about the findings of this and what word of the authorities in London, for example, including MI5?
Well, we simply don't know the response from MI5 just at the moment. We have approached the Internal Security Organisation for comment for their reaction to this report. Operation Kenova, it was started back in 2016. It has finally produced the final report here this morning. It is another chapter as Northern Ireland struggles to come to terms with the very dark legacy of the Troubles. Stakeknife, as the agent was known, as probably the most notorious spy at any stage during that period. 30-year conflict that cost around 3,500 lives on all sides. Stakeknife has never been publicly identified by his handlers, by the British government. That forms part of this report and its recommendations today. But it is widely accepted by everybody here in Northern Ireland that it was the late Republican, the late IRA member, Freddie Scappaticci, who was indeed Stakeknife. He was identified as such more than 20 years ago now by several newspapers in Britain and Ireland. He fled the country. He went into hiding in Britain, and it's always denied that he was, in fact, Stakeknife. But that is a denial that nobody here in Northern Ireland actually accepts. You mentioned there that this investigation, which was 7 years, around £40 million in the making, issued an interim report last year. And many of those findings are echoed here in this final report. We already knew, for example, that the necessary evil school of thought was greatly exaggerated. For years, people said that Freddie Scappaticci may have been involved in dozens of murders, but his actions and his vast amounts of intelligence reports to the British, in fact, saved hundreds of lives. That was blown out of the water by the work of Operation Kenova, which found that he probably actually cost more lives than he saved in Northern Ireland during that period. He came from humble beginnings, the son of Italian immigrants to Belfast, very talented youth footballer. He became a bricklayer. By 1969, he had joined the Provisional IRA at the very start of the Troubles. He then rose to head the IRA's brutal and infamous internal security unit. It was called the Nutting Squad, simply because they executed people by shooting them in the nut, the head. His job was spy catcher. He would find assigned IRA informants to the British. They would be brutally tortured, shot and dumped, their families stigmatised for decades after. All the while, he himself was a British agent supplying vast amounts of intelligence to the security forces at the height of the Troubles. This report identified more than 3,500 separate pieces of intelligence that he provided. Now, the problem wasn't with the quantity of the intelligence or the nature of the intelligence. It was simply, as we heard last year and confirmed again in this report today, that the British security forces handlers did not act on the vast amounts of intelligence to save lives. Why? Because they were more concerned with protecting what was described as their golden egg within the IRA. And former IRA members have been really clear about this. His position in heading up that internal security unit meant that pretty much every major IRA operation, certainly in Belfast, went through Freddie Scappaticci. He had knowledge of almost every major IRA operation, which meant that the British had knowledge of almost every IRA major operation, certainly in the Belfast region. So that meant they were very keen throughout the 1980s to protect the identity of Stakeknife and to protect his operation. As such, he's been implicated in dozens of murders, but today, as families of many of those victims associated with the Nutting Squad start to digest the findings of this report, it's clear that prosecutors here in Northern Ireland have already looked at the findings from this report and found that there isn't sufficient evidence for any prosecution. So we're here in the Stormont Hotel in Belfast. This report has just been issued to the media. We're about to hear from the lead investigators themselves, at which chance we'll hopefully have an opportunity to find out a little bit more about this. The main finding, as far as they're concerned this morning, is that they now feel the time for official silence from London is over, and that Stakeknife should now be publicly identified. That needs to go to the Prime Minister. We have approached Downing Street for comment. We have not heard anything back at the moment. We understand, however, that the UK's government position is there are some outstanding civil legal issues which prevent such a naming taking place, and it always runs contrary to the British military policy of neither confirm nor deny. That always protected the identity of these intelligence assets even after they were deceased. We haven't had a chance to speak to family members just yet. They are converging here. They will give their own press conference here in the Stormont Hotel a bit later on. But certainly some of these details, as I said, we knew some of the broader aspects, but there's details emerging here. The organisation set up within the British military to run Stakelknife is called the Rat Hole. His motivations appear to be primarily financial. He was paid an average wage at one stage. He received lump sums of tens of thousands of pounds. And at a time when the RUC, the police service here in Northern Ireland at that time, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, were hunting this person on suspicion of murder and kidnapping, the British security forces twice flew him out on military aircraft out of Northern Ireland to enjoy a holiday, complete with military identification. These are the sort of details from this extensive 7-year investigation that will really gall many people here in Northern Ireland as they start to digest this. As I said, the latest in a very long series of legacy reports and issues. A look into Stakeknife, the single most notorious British mole within the IRA during the Troubles.
Stephen, I can just tell you, we're just hearing MI5 Director General Sir Ken McCullum has offered sympathies, is the quote, to the victims and families of those who were tortured or killed by the Provisional IRA's internal security unit during the Troubles following the publication of that Kenova report. So an initial reaction being brought to us there from MI5 Director General Sir Ken McCullum. I'm also interested, lots of focus on Stakeknife and Scappaticci in this multi-hundred-page report. Are we finding out any other details about the wider challenges faced during the Troubles?
Well, firstly, the family members, I don't wish to speak on their behalf, but we will be interviewing them and speaking to them fairly shortly. But I know that sympathies and expressions of sympathies will really only go so far in terms of their pain and anguish, which has lasted for many decades. They would have several, I'm sure, follow-up questions to that in terms of the late discovery and the late provision of MI5 files and materials to this investigative team. We heard Sir Iain Livingstone, the head of Operation Kenova, Kenova said that it may not have affected the decision of prosecutors not to prosecute, but it certainly cost them further investigative opportunities, and I think therefore there will be further questions for MI5 and the other British security services. Certainly, I mean, going through this report, this was a dirty, dirty war on all sides. Ethics were compromised by all sides. Many of the victims of the Nutting Squad were themselves actively engaged in murderous activities as well. So it is a murky episode in what was a very brutal and vicious war, dirty tactics carried out on all sides. Some of the details in this report certainly lay that clear, that nobody was operating in a black and white environment in Northern Ireland from 1969 through to the 70s and 80s when the recruitment of Stakeknife took place. He was stood down from the IRA when it was clear that that service, that internal security unit that he headed, had been compromised by intelligence services. He avoided the fate of many of his fellow Republican traitors, that of interrogation, torture, and a swift execution, and he was then hidden away in Britain and given a false identity, although he later actually appeared in court on hardcore pornography charges later in his life. There is video footage of him even confronting a TV crew in his hideaway in Britain in later years, using very colourful language to tell them to leave him alone, and he went to his grave denying that he was indeed Stakeknife, but nobody here doubts that was false, and that Freddie Scappaticci should be named by the UK government. That, of course, a matter for Number 10 now to consider.
More broadly, Stephen, where are the people of the island of Ireland at as a society in the terms of still processing and seeking justice and understanding and lessons from the Troubles? You know, we've talked a lot of different news stories in recent weeks about court proceedings, about, you know, work between the British and the Irish governments as well to kind of look into commissions. Where are people at still working through the trauma, the deadly trauma, the divisions, some of which still exist, we must acknowledge that as well, of that period of the island of Ireland's history?
It's strange, almost 30 years on from the peace deal that effectively ended the Troubles, or the worst of the Troubles anyway, because we were in a coffee shop on the way up here. I don't think there was a single person there that would have been born before the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. You have a whole generation here that, I suppose, don't have an immediate connection to the sort of crimes that reports and commissions and investigators are looking at. But then again, you may remember our coverage from the acquittal of Soldier F in Belfast a few short weeks ago, and the raw emotion, the pain that we saw, the outbursts of very strong language being hurled from one side to another, to understand that legacy investigations and how to resolve those legacy investigations and move Northern Ireland further in its post-conflict stage are extremely emotive here in Northern Ireland still, particularly among the older generation and those, of course, that were immediately affected. This may be one of the last lengthy multi-million-pound investigations, hefty reports outside of what the government wants to see happen that we may see, because obviously Labour grappling with how to overhaul the Conservatives' Legacy Act. That's still before Parliament at the moment. The body that will deal with that, a reconciliation body, is going to be overhauled hopefully next year. And actually within this report there were some lines there from the Kenova team hoping that the approach they took in this could be learned from and could be emulated in some way by that new body. So there's still a lot of uncertainty surrounding how exactly Labour are overhauling the Legacy Act that the previous government brought in, and what exactly that would mean for people trying to address the legacy. I think on a wider level there is an increasing loss of hope that further prosecutions at this stage will really be brought about. Soldier F, that case was regarded, that's to do with Bloody Sunday, of course, a British soldier accused of murder. He was acquitted on all charges. People look at that and go, well, look, if we couldn't get a successful prosecution in that case, prosecutors here in Northern Ireland, the PPS, have already trawled through all the evidence emerging from years of hard work by these detectives and found that the evidence simply isn't there to get a prosecution as regards the activities of the agent known as Stakeknife. So I think there is mixed feelings, as I said, among younger people here in Northern Ireland. These events seem somewhat distant. Among many others immediately impacted by this, it's fresh, it's raw. They don't know whether we're going to see many more investigations like this, and still a lot of uncertainty, still a lot of people looking to London to see how future investigations or future reconciliations could come about when Northern Ireland continues to grapple with this absolutely murderous part of its history.
Stephen, very aware that there's the report authors and also affected families to hear from. We'll let you go for the moment, but do come back to us when you have some more. Stephen Murphy there for us in Belfast. You're watching Sky News. Just want to bring you a few breaking developments on the arrests connected to that incident at Heathrow on Sunday. Just hearing from the Met Police, who say that the charges of those two individuals will be progressed. They will appear at Hillingdon Magistrates Court shortly. That's in connection with that assault and robbery at Heathrow Airport in the car park of Terminal 3. 5 people were taken to hospital during the discharge of that noxious substance. We're hearing that all have been discharged from hospital. We're hearing that the 31-year-old and 24-year-old have been charged in connection with those alleged offences. Also hearing that a 23-year-old woman was arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to commit robbery, released on bail pending further inquiries. A 57-year-old woman arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to commit robbery, later released under investigation. And on Monday, yesterday, a 31-year-old man arrested on suspicion of a fray. He remains in custody. But we do know that Tyrone Richards of No Fixed Address and Anton Clark Boutcher of Manlock Close will appear before magistrates charged in connection with that robbery in Heathrow's car park on Sunday. More to come as we get it. 11:16, you're watching Sky News. Gareth Barlow with you. The author of a new report into maternity failings has severely criticised what she calls unacceptable care and admitted that nothing prepared her for an investigation. Baroness Amos has published her initial findings after meeting affected families and representatives of 7 of the 12 NHS trusts under investigation. A set of national recommendations will follow, but victims have already expressed concern that the report will lack the teeth necessary to bring about meaningful change. Baroness Amos said things were much worse than she'd anticipated and that issues she consistently encountered included the following. Firstly, women not being listened to throughout their maternity care experience. Mothers not being given the information needed to make informed choices on their maternity care. Discrimination against women of colour, working-class women and women with mental health issues. And a lack of empathy from clinical teams leading to women feeling blamed and guilty if something went wrong.
I have been shocked. I've been shocked because there have been so many reviews before. Over 748 recommendations have been made previously. Yes, some have been implemented, but some have not. We don't know what the impact of those have been, so we're doing a separate piece of work to understand that. But what I have been asked to do is to come up with some clear national recommendations that will stop this and will make a difference. It just cannot continue. There is too much harm, too much distress, too much trauma, and the long-term consequences for families, for communities, and for all of us.
Let's get more details from our health correspondent, Laura Bundock.
Rebecca's children are now 9 and 4, but she's still haunted by the trauma of their births.
The care was, I could only describe it as callous. There wasn't any kindness there. I was left in my own blood.
Rebecca formed a campaign for families failed by Oxford University hospitals, one of 12 NHS trusts under investigation in a maternity review. But Rebecca finds its initial reflections troubling.
I was quite disappointed by the fact that it just seemed to be a bullet point list of failings that actually we've seen time and time again in independent reviews before.
This latest maternity investigation was announced by the Health Secretary Wes Streeting in June after a series of shocking scandals.
Crucially, the investigation team, in terms of referenced, will be co-produced with the victims of maternity scandals. The investigation will also pull together the recommendations from the other reviews that have taken place.
Its interim findings report a lack of communication and support from clinical teams and organisations. how women weren't listened to or given the right information to make informed choices at critical moments of their care, and how women's knowledge of their own bodies was sometimes disregarded. The investigation's chair, Baroness Amos, said nothing prepared her for the scale of unacceptable care women receive, and found it staggering there have been 748 previous recommendations about NHS maternity services. She's visiting parents and hospitals to find out more. In a statement, Oxford University Hospital's chief nurse said, "We're pleased to report that feedback received from patients using our maternity service over the last year is positive overall. However, we know we have more to do to improve our maternity services. Our present focus is on listening to the experiences of women and families, which is helping us to identify opportunities for improvement." The national maternity investigation won't be finished until spring, but some are already worried it won't go far enough to bring meaningful change to maternity services.
It seems as though it is heading the same way that other reviews have gone in the past, leading to some recommendations, but no teeth.
Laura Bundock, Sky News, Oxford.
Just a reminder, there's plenty more on the latest edition of the Sky News Daily Podcast. Neil Patterson speaking to the author and midwife Leah Hazard about the issues surrounding NHS maternity services. You know what to do. Scan that QR code on the screen or follow wherever you get your podcasts. You're watching Sky News Today. Still to come, we're going to bring you plenty more on President Zelensky meeting with the Pope at the papal residence. President Zelensky says Ukraine deeply appreciates Pope Leo's support. We'll bring you all the details in 3 minutes' time. (11:23 on a Tuesday morning. After a day of diplomacy in London and Brussels, the Ukrainian president's just been meeting Pope Leo at the papal residence outside Rome. The Pope stressed the need for just and lasting peace in Ukraine during his meeting with Zelensky in Italy. It comes after he held peace talks with the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, and other European leaders in London yesterday. The Ukrainian president set to share his updated peace proposal with the US today. Let's bring in our defence and security analyst, Michael Clark. It's proposal after proposal after proposal. We don't know what's in this one, though. There's been a bit of a shift change, hasn't there, after that leak of version 1, the very pro-Russian agenda.
28 points, yeah.
28 points.
Immediately, yeah.
Pro-Russian agenda that got leaked. It's all gone a little quiet regarding the details. We do know we're now down to 20 points.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, this is a gap between what the Russians say they will accept, which was effectively surrender terms, and what the Ukrainians have indicated they could just about live with, even though with that 19-point plan that was worked out in Europe and went back to the United States about 10 days ago, even that plan had square brackets in it, which are the things that can only be worked out by the leaders. The negotiators can't get any further with them, so they put them in square brackets. That's standard diplomatic practice. And that's got to be a leadership decision. And the things that we're pretty sure were in the square brackets, which are still in the square brackets, is whether Ukraine will give up territory that the Russians haven't conquered, what the security guarantees might be, and what the size and restrictions on Ukraine's armed forces might be after any peace deal. Now, all of those, I think, are deal breakers. So I think, realistically, we're heading for the failure of this round. This is the third time we've been around the same circle. So we went round it once in April, once in August. We're now going round it again in November, December. And I'd say we're now probably 3/4 or maybe 4/5 of the way round the same circle, which will end up at the same point of failure.
And this all must be, from Putin's perspective, manna from heaven, because the longer that Ukraine, Europe and the USA try and figure out a kind of agreed state of being, they're still making advances from the Russian perspective. Sumy knocked out all of the power last night to a significant-sized city. It reported no fatalities, but drones are still smashing into infrastructure, into buildings. There's still a grinding assault across most of that front line. The longer this lack of consensus from the Western perspective goes on, it only surely plays into the hands of the Kremlin. Yeah,
it's back to the old reality that we started with at the beginning of the year. Putin believes he's winning the war. Now, we know that he's gaining slowly. He's not winning it as decisively as he says he is or thinks he is, but he's gaining territory. They're not gaining in the Black Sea. They're giving Ukrainians a miserable winter, but they're also suffering themselves with a lot of Ukrainian attacks on the oil refineries that are hurting the Russian economy. But they are moving forward, and Putin's belief is he doesn't want a ceasefire because he thinks he'll gain more by continuing to fight. But he's convinced, or seems to have convinced, President Trump that he would agree to something as long as the something was heavily in Russia's favour. And so, President Trump is trying to square a circle here. And we all know, and everybody in Europe knows, that this is almost certain to fail as a peace process. The question is, who does President Trump blame for the failure? And at the moment, Putin seems to be getting just what he wants, is that Trump looks as if he's going to blame the Europeans and Zelensky for the failure.
And you then have the situation that the United States sets out its national security policy document, kind of 20 or so pages, and the Russians say it aligns with much of what we perceive in the world.
Yeah, it's a very strange document. I spent Saturday morning reading it, and it's a dog's dinner of a strategy document.
It's not very coherent. I read it as well.
It's completely incoherent, full of contradictions. However, underlying it is a very
Europe.
The United States does not see itself particularly as part of NATO. It sees itself as in opposition to what Europe is, not in security terms, but in civilizational terms. And it is a document of what's known as Christian nationalism. I mean, what has gripped the Trump administration and MAGA republicanism is Christian nationalism, which puts that sense of ideology, which is based on race, Christianity and nationalism ahead of liberal democracy, ahead of international law. That document only once talks about international law, rules-based international order, and it calls it the so-called rules-based international order, which is like putting inverted commas around it, something we mention but we don't believe in. It pushes it back against globalisation and globalism, globalist, and it calls the EU globalist. So it's a document that is based on Christian nationalist principles, which are very different to the way Europe is evolving in our own liberal democracy. And Ukraine is the crucible now of this difference in the transatlantic relationship. So the transatlantic relationship is now in deep, deep trouble, just as Ukraine is in deep trouble.
Michael, always a pleasure. Plenty more from Michael throughout the course of the day. It's 11:28. Let's take a look at the weather, shall we? It's going to talk more about Storm Bram in particular, bringing potentially disruptive and heavy rain and strong winds throughout the course of the day. Let's look at the amber warnings, shall we, in place for wind over northwestern UK and all of Ireland through the course of today. There's also widespread yellow warnings for wind and rain. Most of Britain will see showery outbreaks to start the afternoon. They'll be heavy in places, but the far north can expect more general rain, temperatures in the mid-teens. Meanwhile, Ireland and Northern Ireland look mainly dry, but the southwest will be wet. Strong winds will bring 50 to 60 mile-an-hour gusts to the west. Higher on coasts and hills, it'll be very mild. Northwestern parts will see more rain and very strong winds going into the evening. Severe coastal gales likely. Elsewhere, it'll stay windy. Most places will dry up. You're watching Sky News. Still to come after the break. We're going to take you live to Belfast. We're expecting a press statement from the Police Service of Northern Ireland following the publication of the report Operation Kenova into the activities of the British spy Stakeknife, who operated at the heart of the IRA. Reaction from those that authored the report, reaction too from the families of those affected. You're watching Sky News. Good to have you with us. We're keeping a close eye on this scene in Belfast. We're expecting to hear from the detective in charge of Operation Kenova, Sir Iain Livingstone, and the Police Service of Northern Ireland's Chief Constable, John Boutcher, who will be giving a news conference shortly. This is following the publication of that report, 7 years in the making, £40 million in cost. We've heard the interim report previously, but this is looking at the work, some might say, but certainly the life and impact of Freddie Scappaticci, who died in 2023, but was a British agent who operated at the very heart and the very height of the IRA. He had been interned with no trial in the early 1970s, but then became a paid army spy by in the 1980s. He was at the heart of the IRA's security unit, the so-called nutting squad, and was directly linked to at least 18 murders while on the state payroll, although some estimates say that he maybe directed up to 30 killings. In an interim PSNI report, it was said that more lives were lost than were saved through the intelligence that Scappaticci, the agent known as Stakeknife, provided. And the report had been leaked ahead of its main publication today. It was critical of MI5 as well. We've heard today that the report has called on the authorities to publicly acknowledge and reveal the identity of Stakeknife. We don't expect that at this precise moment. The British government and security authorities have long had the neither confirm nor deny state when it comes to security operations and the names and statuses of informants as well. For his part, prior to his death in 2023, Scappaticci had always denied being an agent within the IRA, but it's widely acknowledged that he was revealed by the press in 2003. So we're expecting to hear more about his activities, the interplay between the IRA and also MI5, the Army and Security Forces, during the Troubles and in the years subsequent to. When we get to that press conference, we'll bring it to you live here on Sky News. It's 11:35. Let's talk about some of the day's other stories, shall we? One that's making lots of headlines: a new design for trains in the United Kingdom has been revealed by the Transport Secretary today. Train services already in public ownership will begin to adopt a Union flag-inspired design from this spring. It's part of the government's efforts to nationalise most rail passenger services in the country and run them under the new Great British Railways flag.
So we're actually going to start to roll out the new branding at stations and on trains from next year, but we want to do this in a way that's going to provide value for money for the travelling public and for the taxpayer. I think people want me to be focused on getting the basics right, making sure that the trains turn up on time, that they're as likely to come on a Sunday afternoon as they are on a Monday morning. And so I don't think I would be thanked if I was on your show this morning announcing that we were spending hundreds of millions of pounds on repainting 3,000 trains across the network. Yeah. But it is an exciting moment because we're debating in Parliament today the Railways Bill, which is the most significant piece of legislation to affect the running of the railways for 30 years. We've announced the fares freeze for next year, but we're also going to be putting the railways back into the service of passengers, not being focused on profit and shareholders. And as we bring those train operating companies back into public ownership, we're determined to build a railway that people can rely on and be proud of. And
Now then, two men have been charged in connection with
Right, good morning everybody and welcome, and thank you for coming. So, I especially want to welcome the many families that are here today who've been impacted by the awful crime that's subject of the Kenova final report. This has been and that has changed my life, Sir Iain's, and everybody involved in Operation Kenova. And that's because the victims in this room represent courage, humility and dignity. And it's been a privilege to come to know you. I'll now invite Sir Iain Livingstone, the officer in overall command, to introduce his final report, after which I will make some remarks. Thank you.
Chief Constable John, thank you, and I will try my best to project to fill the room, as well as the media microphones that are here. Investigating and reviewing events from decades ago is extremely complex, where evidence is often lost, contaminated or diminished over time. This applies in all jurisdictions and to all crimes. But to seek the truth and provide information to victims and families is harder still when the events under investigation occurred during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, where opposing perspectives are common and where achieving the trust of all communities is critical. Kenova has shown that it can be done. It requires investigative drive and a complete commitment to victims and families. 9 years after being established, this final report captures the experience of Kenova and the issues that have arisen as we pursued evidence and answers. I have been the officer in overall command for the last 2 years, and it is a privilege to submit this final report. However, the greatest privilege that I have had has been the opportunity to meet and listen to victims and families from the Troubles, who consistently demonstrate dignity and grace in the face of appalling suffering from brutal terrorism, at times compounded by state failures to act legitimately or with empathy and care. Through John's leadership, Kenova has from the outset put the interests of victims and families at the heart of its approach. We learned that an outcome through the criminal justice process may in fact not always be achievable or even what is desired. Kenova detectives prioritise listening and being responsive to questions unanswered for decades. And this morning, as we have always done, we recognise the courage and commitment of the police officers, soldiers and other members of the security forces who sought to uphold the rule of law in Northern Ireland during the tremendously challenging times of the Troubles. Kenova benefited from the personal experiences they shared with us to help an understanding of the pressures they were under and the environment in which they were operating. The undertaking given by Kenova to issue public reports wherever possible was innovative, informing fellow citizens of what was found, even where criminal prosecutions did not result. It added time and complexity around issues of national security and individual confidentiality, but it was another key element in building trust and confidence in victims and families and across wider society, of which the publication of this report this morning is a key part. Gathering intelligence is essential to prevent terrorism, to save life and to investigate crime. The use of informants or agents has been and will remain an important source of such intelligence. In addition, the protection of those sources is vital for their safety and to ensure individuals in the future will provide intelligence to state authorities. The policy of NCND to neither confirm nor deny is well established and an important safeguard for those who provide intelligence. Having spent my life in policing, I support NCND and know its value. Although the policy's definition and use require review, in my opinion, Kenova has no intention to undermine NCND. However, NCND must be exercised in a proportionate and necessary manner and should not be an absolute bar to providing truth and justice. It cannot be used to protect agents who commit grotesque, serious crime, leaving victims and families ignored and their demands for information and answers dismissed. As this final report makes clear, we in Kenova believe there is a compelling ethical case for the UK Government to derogate from the NCND policy regarding the agent Stakeknife's identity. It is in the public interest that Stakeknife is named. We may have completed this report far earlier had MI5 not discovered fresh material relating to Stakeknife in the spring of 2024. These revelations, which continued over a number of months during 2024, were extremely disappointing, given that the investigation into Stakeknife had been completed and decisions not to prosecute already taken by the Public Prosecution Service for Northern Ireland. The circumstances regarding the new MI5 material are set out fully in this final report. This morning, I would reiterate how shocked we were within Kenova to learn of this new material, and how desperately disappointed we were to then explain to victims and families that we had not, in fact, received all relevant material, despite past assurances. The new material revealed that MI5 had greater and earlier knowledge of Stakeknife than we had previously been told. PPSNI, the Public Prosecution Service, had a view that the material would not have altered prosecution decisions, although investigative opportunities were undoubtedly lost as a consequence of MI5's late disclosure of relevant material. But the very fact that material owned and held by MI5 was not timorously disclosed understandably undermined the confidence of communities that state authorities had cooperated fully with Kenova. The Director-General of MI5 shared this concern, and he therefore committed resources to establish and disclose all the material it held. But notwithstanding the Director-General recognising the issue, it was a significant failure on the part of MI5. Once Kenova had become established, it quickly and rightly built a reputation for integrity and investigative excellence. Accordingly, Kenova was subsequently tasked by the PSNI to conduct additional independent investigations and reviews beyond its initial commission regarding the conduct of the agent Stakeknife. These additional elements were made up of Operation Mizzenmast, the investigation into the murder of Jean Smith Campbell in 1972, Operation Turma, the murders of Sergeant Sean Quinn and Constables Paul Hamilton and Alan McCloy, and an explosion at Kinnigo Embankment in 1982, and Operation Denton, a review into the Glenanne series. Now, summaries of these three operations also form part of this final report. Operation Denton differed from the other Kenova operations in that it was a review rather than a criminal investigation. However, in addition to reviewing previous investigations and materials, the Denton review team also looked for and discovered new information on what had become known as the Glenanne series. These were vicious sectarian murders and attacks in the 1970s, carried out against members of the Catholic community in both Northern Ireland and Ireland, a number of which involved deplorable collusion with loyalist terrorists on the part of some serving police officers and members of the military. There is no doubt that collusion took place, much of it long established publicly before Denton was actually initiated. And our findings show that it manifested itself in various corrupt ways and beyond any identifiable distinct group. The extent of involvement in sectarian attacks by some members of the security forces was shocking, but we did not see any evidence that it occurred or was directed at a political or strategic level. Across the entirety of the Kenova work, the team has worked intensely to seek answers, provide explanations, and pursue justice. At times, some of our findings did not align with what victims and families expected, often due to false narratives and theories being developed, at times understandably, due to a vacuum of information. However, our duty was to seek the truth relentlessly and then share as fully as we could with those who deserved to hear it and who had endured the traumatic attacks. Kenova has now completed its work. What about the future? I assess that Kenova greatly influenced the joint framework from the governments of Ireland and the United Kingdom issued in September earlier this year. Both governments had been told by victims and families and groups who support them that the approach, the ethos and the experience of Kenova represented best practice. Investigations must be rigorous, independent, and have access to all information. Victims and families must be central to all policies and actions. There can be no immunity for those who committed murder and serious crime. A robust disclosure regime must exist, and oversight and governance must accompany investigations and information recovery. Victim focus groups and advisory boards can be established to assist legacy work. Now, of course, the manner in which both governments give effect to the framework will be paramount, and both have made commitments to provide funding and legislative time for implementation. They have also committed to share information across borders and to ensure their respective state agencies comply with requests for information. In the UK, the government has introduced the Northern Ireland Troubles Bill, which will repeal the 2023 Legacy Act and establish a reformed Legacy Commission and a joint independent commission for information retrieval. The Northern Ireland Troubles Bill does not reflect all elements of Kenova, and ensuring investigators have access to all information must be enabled through the bill. It will therefore be critical how the bill is amended and then implemented as it goes through Parliament, including whether sufficient resources and investigative powers are allocated to the reformed Legacy Commission. Notwithstanding my comments, in my view, this new legislation and the shared approach from the UK and Irish governments should be welcomed as a foundation for progress. It is right to build on the existing structures, as for many victims and families affected by the Troubles, time is of the essence. Addressing legacy matters from the Troubles in Northern Ireland in a fair and transparent manner is vital to acknowledge the suffering of families and provide answers for what happened in the past. But it is also a vital enabler for today, to ensure the continued legitimacy of policing and other state agencies now and in the future. Before I hand back to Chief Constable Boutcher, I think it appropriate to take us back to the start of Kenova, which began with a request to examine the activities of the alleged Army agent codenamed Stakeknife. Thus, for transparency and understanding, I will summarise what I see as key facts regarding Stakeknife, which Kenova has established. Stakeknife was recruited as an Army agent in the late 1970s and operated as such for over a decade into the 1990s. Throughout this period of operation, Stakeknife met his handlers on average once every 7 or 8 days. The RUC Special Branch and MI5 knew of Stakeknife's recruitment and identity from the outset and were supplied with his intelligence throughout, including reports disclosing his involvement in the abduction and interrogation of suspected agents who were then murdered by the IRA. The further material disclosed by MI5 in 2025 covered almost the entirety of the period of Stakeknife's operation. During an 18-month period at the start of his career as an agent, Stakeknife produced at least 377 intelligence reports, and a total of 3,517 intelligence reports attributed to him were ultimately recovered by Kenova. Further, in the period between the conclusion of the Stevens inquiry in the early 2000s and the commencement of Operation Kenova in 2016, the MOD destroyed original documents relating to Stakeknife, including, for example, and importantly, 2 files of contact forms which recorded meetings with his handlers. At different points, both the RUC Special Branch and MI5 offered or sought to take over the running of Stakeknife from the Army. Following the recruitment of Stakeknife, the Army established a dedicated subunit known as the Rat Hole, specifically to deal with Stakeknife's handling and intelligence. MI5 had a member of staff permanently located within the rat hole. A bespoke database known as BogRat 3970 and Osborne was established to process Stakeknife's intelligence, but no trace of that database remains. A number of Stakeknife's army handlers went on to work for MI5, including as Assistant Secretary Political and Deputy Assistant Secretary Political, supporting the Director and Coordinator of Intelligence, a role which was MI5's main representative for Northern Ireland and acted as the principal security advisor to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. MI5 was involved in tasking Stakeknife through his military handlers, and it received debriefs on all his intelligence and was involved in discussions about his role, importance and use. Furthermore, MI5 also supported his operation through the provision of specialist support. Stakeknife's army handlers routinely massaged his ego, for example, telling him that if he stopped reporting, quotes, the loss would be felt throughout the intelligence world, close quotes. The army also paid Stakeknife tens of thousands of pounds and helped him purchase a property. They discussed ways he could obscure the ownership of his assets so as to protect him against future potential legal claims. And they discussed the provision of a 5- or 6-figure sum to cover a pension or salary for Stakeknife. For a period towards the end of the 1980s, the Army temporarily stopped sharing Stakeknife's intelligence with the RUC because it suspected that the RUC has used it to identify someone suspected of murdering a police officer, and therefore this could have compromised Stakeknife's identity. Early attempts to resettle Stakeknife were unsuccessful, and he was eventually resettled in Great Britain in the mid-2000s in a detached property and a private motor vehicle. Stakeknife's army handlers flew him out of Northern Ireland on military aircraft for holidays on 2 occasions when they knew that he was wanted by the RUC for conspiracy to murder and false imprisonment. Kenova prosecution files named Stakeknife as a suspect in connection with more than 24 offences, including allegations of conspiracy to murder, conspiracy to unlawfully imprison, conspiracy to kidnap, false imprisonment, unlawful wounding, grievous bodily harm, and unlawful possession of firearms. These are key facts established by Kenova regarding the agent Stakeknife. I'll conclude by a reflection that, in my view, Kenova has made a substantial contribution to how legacy matters should be approached. In particular, its focus on victims and families must be retained in the reformed institutions and practices going forward. It is those victims and families that all of us in Kenova have sought to serve. I will now pass back to the Chief Constable, John Boutcher. John.
Thank you, Iain. If people can't hear me, please raise your hands. I particularly want to make sure that the victims and families in the room can hear what I'm saying. So I want to begin my remarks today by acknowledging and thanking the many legacy victims and families who've shared their experiences so openly with the team across the suite of Kenova investigations. Sadly, some of those who spoke to us have since passed away, and we will never forget them. Most of us in this room can never comprehend the trauma suffered by these families over decades. I'm humbled and will be forever grateful for everything they've done to shape, support and inspire our investigations. They deserve to know the truth of what happened to their loved ones. The Kenova reports are dedicated to them, and I hope the information we've given them has helped them in some small way deal with what happened. I'd also like to personally thank Sir Iain and everyone involved in Operation Kenova for the meticulous professional investigations that they carried out, and to thank the independent Kenova governance groups who've overseen this work Their expertise, commitment and focus has been crucial in maintaining the victim-focused approach. I believe this approach has set the standard for how legacy investigations should be carried out through victim engagement and how they should be governed and overseen. This is a view supported by many of those who gave evidence to the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee on the government's approach to addressing the legacy of the past. It's my sincere hope that Kenova serves as the blueprint for legacy investigations and the government's new legacy framework. The key findings of Kenova were made public in the interim report published on the 8th of March last year. This was a deliberate decision to ensure that any new legacy legislation would not impact our ability to confirm what many legacy families had suspected for a long time about state involvement and non-intervention.
It's exactly 12 o'clock. You're watching Sky News and a live press conference from Belfast following the publication of Operation Kenova, a 7-year investigation, £40 million in cost into the operations of Stakeknife, a British Army spy at the heart of the IRA.
Since publication of the interim report. The Kenova investigation shone a light on one of the darkest periods of Northern Ireland's history. Barely a generation has passed, but so much of what happened in this period is hard to imagine as we sit in today's modern Northern Ireland. The actions carried out by the IRA's Internal Security Unit against members of their own community are barely believable in their level of brutality. Their actions and those of the Republican leadership which initiated and sanctioned them were utterly abhorrent, wrong and inexcusable. The families of those accused of being state agents, women, children and the elderly, were also subjected to violence, and many have faced years of intimidation, isolation and humiliation at the hands of those who murdered their loved ones. The suffering of those families has undoubtedly been amplified by the failures of the state. The failure to protect individuals, the failure to properly investigate their murders, and latterly, the failure to provide survivors with the answers to which they are entitled. I've said before that the security forces operated under exceptionally dangerous and stressful conditions with extreme time pressures. They were sometimes presented with impossible decisions that had no right answer, because protecting one individual would simply expose another. Mistakes were made, and this was inevitable. However, a lack of regulation, oversight, and leadership were critical factors. These combined with the development of a situation where intelligence and investigatory functions were seen as separate, and the security forces repeatedly withheld and failed to act on information about threats to life, abductions and murders. They did this in order to protect the identity of the agents providing the information. The Kenova investigation has demonstrated that murders that could and should have been prevented were allowed to take place, and those responsible were not brought to justice. Instead, they were left free to kill again. In the aftermath of these brutal crimes, many families were never given even the most basic information about what had happened to their loved ones. There are many reasons for this, including the dangerous operating environment at the time, which made it difficult, if not impossible, for the police to meet families. However, as families will testify, and has been demonstrated repeatedly through legacy inquiries, there was a culture within the security forces of withholding information. While security forces have a duty to protect the identity of their agents, time and time again, Kenova found evidence that source protection was treated as being more important than protecting other people's lives, the criminal justice system and the rule of law. The army agent known as Stakeknife was central to the efforts of the security forces to gather intelligence about the IRA's internal security unit. I'll repeat what I've said in the past. Stakeknife was one individual. Stakeknife was an important source of intelligence, but he was also involved in the most serious and inexcusable criminality whilst operating as an agent, including murders. Stakeknife's activity resulted in more lives being lost than were saved. Even if that had not been the case, the morality and legality of agents doing such harm as torture and murder with the knowledge and protection of the state would be unacceptable today and should have been then. Agents must act within the law. They are not immune from prosecution, and they cannot be given absolute assurances of anonymity and confidentiality, regardless of what they do. Stakeknife's true identity has been the subject of public claims and legal action for years. If he'd been a police agent, I would have named him in the knowledge that this would not have put anyone at risk of harm or affected the recruitment and retention of agents in support of contemporary policing. However, because Stakeknife was an army agent, the government has the final say when it comes to his identification. It's therefore incredibly disappointing that despite repeated requests from Sir Iain, the government has refused to authorise the Kenova final report to identify Stakeknife. The government's position is that naming him would breach its neither confirm nor deny NCND policy in connection with the identification of state agents. I completely agree that agents need to be protected by a cloak of anonymity and enhanced secrecy. Otherwise, they will not come forward. But this cannot amount to immunity or a right to act with impunity. Society and the courts will rightfully support the NCND approach based on the very reasonable assumption that agents and the security agencies act properly and within the rule of law. However, when this is not the case, as with Stakeknife, NCND can cease to serve the public interest and become the enemy of accountability and justice. In such situations, it must be put to one side. It is ironic that those arguing most strongly for NCND against the identification of Stakeknife, the security agencies, so abjectly failed to protect so many of their own agents from him, despite the risks they were running on behalf of those agencies. They simply allowed people to be harmed and killed to protect his identity. The NCND policy has always allowed for exceptions, whereby the agent status can be confirmed or denied if circumstances demand. The final Kenova report highlights such examples relating to Northern Ireland, and none of them had any adverse impact on the recruitment or retention of agents, the supply of secret intelligence, or national security. No statement about the identity of Stakeknife can be made without reference to Freddie Scappaticci. He is publicly alleged to have been a senior member of the IRA Internal Security Unit and to have been Stakeknife. To directly quote a solicitor for the Kenova families who spoke to the BBC in 2024, the dogs in the street know that Fred Scappaticci is the agent Stakeknife. Scappaticci remained a critical person of interest at the heart of Operation Kenova, and strong evidence was found implicating him in serious criminality. He was arrested, interviewed under caution, and files on him were submitted to the Director of Public Prosecutions for Northern Ireland. In 2018, he was convicted in England for possession of extreme pornography. In March 2023, before any prosecution decisions were announced, Scappaticci died aged 77. He was never charged with or convicted of any Troubles-related offences, and always denied any wrongdoing or involvement with the security forces. On the 13th of April of 2023, the Public Prosecution Service of Northern Ireland announced a no decision outcome on 10 out of 28 Operation Kenova files following the death early that year of the only suspect named within them. Freddie Scappaticci was that suspect. He was the person referred to in this final report as being reported for perjury offences. The perjury matter is set out in the interim report. On the 28th of July this year, the High Court in London ordered that Scappaticci's will be sealed under Section 124 of the Senior Courts Act of 1981. As I understand it, this was the first time such an order has been made in connection with the will of someone who was not a member of the royal family. The person making the application used a pseudonym and claimed their life would be at risk if public inspection of the will was allowed. I cannot comment on the evidence put before the judge, but can say that I'm not aware of any information to suggest that public inspection of Mr. Scappaticci's will would put anyone at risk. As already mentioned, the government's refusal to allow Kenova to confirm whether or not Scappaticci was Stakeknife means that this final report cannot go into public detail about the crimes it investigated. When I was in charge of Kenova, I was often asked, why can't you report on what Stakelknife did, but without naming him? Unfortunately, any attempt to do this would face government security objections. The IRA's internal security unit was not large, and a lot is publicly known about the activities and the movements of Scappaticci. Any report connecting Stakelknife with particular dates, places or victims would quickly reveal whether or not he was Scappaticci. As a result, the truth is still being unnecessarily suppressed decades after the events in question, and this is having a profound and severe adverse impact on victims and families, legitimate public discussion and debate, media freedom, open justice, and public confidence in state agencies and the criminal justice system. The ongoing secrecy is also fueling further grievance, conspiracy theories, and the suffering of his victims and their families. Furthermore, it also allows the government to hide behind the shield of NCND, refrain from comment, and avoid accountability. This extends not only to the operation and resettlement of Stakeknife, but also to the fallout from the public allegations that he was Scappaticci. These allegations led to convictions being quashed, Scappaticci being resettled in England at great public expense, Scappaticci bringing applications for judicial review and an injunction on the basis he was not Stakeknife and was at risk of harm if discovered, and now the sealing of his will. None of these matters can be subject to proper public scrutiny and understanding while the identity of Stakeknife remains unconfirmed. I question whether this decision protects agents, or rather, does it actually protect the government and intelligence agencies from accountability for historical wrongdoing? By way of example, Scappaticci's judicial review challenging the government's refusal to deny that he was Stakeknife, which was at the heart of the perjury allegations against him, led to a judgment which is routinely relied on in support of the NCND policy. However, the Lord Chief Justice who gave that judgment and decided to hear the case after being secretly briefed as to the true identity of Stakeknife, and yet the government has never had to explain this. Kenova's position, which I strongly share, is that the circumstances of this case are exceptional and the identity of Stakeknife should be officially confirmed so that the truth as to all these matters can be laid to bear and properly scrutinised. I believe the government's refusal to allow this is untenable and bordering on farce. And as someone who's worked in this space for more than 3 decades, I do not accept that a departure from NCND would impact, let alone damage national security. Indeed, the contrary would occur. Naming him would lead to government scrutiny and accountability that would ultimately strengthen national security and lead to the better protection of agents. Like the accountability we've recently seen in the Hillsborough disaster, such holding to account must eventually happen. I think it's important to make clear that the official identification of Stakeknife would not put anyone in Northern Ireland at any risk of harm. The final report also sets out the impact of the late disclosure by MI5, 8 years after the investigation began and days after the initial Kenova report had been published, of additional relevant material relating to Stakeknife. This was deeply frustrating. It delayed the publication of this final report and undermined the confidence of families and stakeholders in the process. Trust, which the Kenova team had patiently built up and earned over years, was undoubtedly shaken, if not lost for some. The new material revealed that MI5 had greater and earlier knowledge of Stakeknife than had been previously disclosed. The organisation's role in running Stakeknife was far from peripheral, as had been claimed. While the DPP for Northern Ireland is of the view that the new material would not have altered his prosecution decisions on the Kenova files, investigative opportunities, as Sir Iain has explained, were undoubtedly lost. No new murders were uncovered, but incidents were detailed which could have been put to witnesses, generated new lines of inquiry, and perhaps formed the basis for submissions to the Director of Public Prosecutions for additional offences. We will never know the full impact of this late discovery. This episode undoubtedly represents a serious organisational failure on the part of MI5. I have significant concerns that the enduring influence of MI5 on legacy matters and its approach to NCND will undermine the trust and confidence of families and others seeking the truth in the willingness and ability of the security forces to provide them with the answers that they deserve. Without this, any new legacy arrangements will not succeed. There is a further risk that the government appears to be listening most intently to those who've done the most to frustrate legacy investigations. The new legacy framework sets out that organisations holding legacy material will be responsible for classifying documents and deciding what is relevant. That is wrong. A key lesson from Kenova, as set out in its second recommendation, is that the obligation to disclose must be unqualified. I believe the decision on relevance must sit with the new Legacy Commission. Only the legacy investigator will be in a position to properly decide on the relevance of material. As the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, I'm determined that all information, including all sensitive information relevant to Troubles-related cases, will be disclosed to the new Legacy Commission. There is a very real policing cost to legacy that goes beyond the £24 million of a bill that it brings to the PSNI each year. It's clear that the failure to satisfactorily address the legacy of the past is a significant factor undermining community support for policing. Perceptions about our role in legacy represent an ongoing barrier to attracting increased numbers of officers from a Catholic background. Legacy must be addressed in a way that has the support and confidence of victims and every community. Today's report contains summaries of other legacy investigations and reviews undertaken by the Kenova team, Operations Mizzenmast, Terma and Denton. I'm limited in what I can say publicly at this stage on each of these. Out of respect of the views of the Jean Smith Campbell family, I do not intend to discuss Operation Mizzenmast here. Operation Terma, the investigation of the murder of Sergeant Sean Quinn and Constables Paul Hamilton and Alan McCloy, is subject to ongoing criminal proceedings. Operation Denton, an independent review of a series of sectarian gun and bomb attacks committed by loyalists between 1972 and 1978. Those responsible included members of the security forces. They were referred to as the Glenanne Gang. The full Denton report will be published in due course, but I want to draw out of its conclusions some of the significant public matters of interest. A number of the incidents within the Glenanne Gang series involved members of the security forces who were arrested and convicted of serious terrorist offences. Loyalists were provided with intelligence by corrupt members of the security forces. There is clear evidence of collusion with the UVF by state actors. However, the review found no evidence that the RUC was involved or complicit with the activities of extremists or terrorists at a corporate or organisational level. In a number of cases, information about the involvement of prominent loyalists was not acted upon. Whilst there was clear collusion between loyalist terrorists and some members of the UDR and RUC, the review has not discovered any material which indicates that the security forces systematically collaborated with prolific offenders, or that any individual or group were organisationally protected by the security forces. Denton did not find evidence of high-level state collusion or an intent on the part of the leadership of the British Army or the UK government to collaborate with loyalist paramilitaries. In addition, no material has been discovered which evidences or implies a deliberate strategy on behalf of the security forces or the UK government to either not pursue or actively support the activities of loyalist terrorists. The 1974 Dublin and Monaghan bombings were some of the most shocking incidents during the period of the Troubles, killing 33 innocent civilians. During the course of the review work carried out by Operation Denton into these bombings, strong views were expressed alleging collusion on the part of the British state. The review team has therefore been particularly rigorous in seeking evidence of collusion relating to these attacks. This is a matter of legitimate public interest, and it's therefore important the Operation Denton findings are clear. These were: the UVF in Belfast and Mid-Ulster was responsible for the 1974 Dublin and Monaghan bombings. The UVF independently possessed the necessary materials, knowledge and expertise to mount these attacks without any support from the security forces. There was no specific intelligence which, if acted upon, could have prevented the bombings. In the aftermath of the attacks, the RUC and Army were in possession of intelligence which identified a number of those believed to have been involved in the attacks. No new information has been discovered by Operation Denton which would confirm or contradict a view that the Glenanne farm played a role in the attacks. The review has not identified any evidence or intelligence which would indicate that British security forces colluded with the UVF to carry out these attacks, nor has any evidence of state collusion been identified. In concluding, and thank you for your patience, the final Kenova report outlines the challenges of conducting legacy investigations, but demonstrates that no matter how difficult they can be, it is possible to find the truth of what happened for many victims and their families. Many victims have remarked to me that Kenova has, I quote, changed the landscape of legacy. And also, and I quote, it's changed the weather regarding the disclosure of information. We still have more to do. I hope that the information provided to victims and families and the approach taken has helped these remarkable people. I also hope, alongside a new impetus to address legacy on both sides of the border, this report will encourage everyone involved to redouble their efforts to find a joint solution to this troubled past. We owe this to all of the families that have suffered during the Troubles. As Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, I promise I will continue to play my part. Thank you. And I think we're now going to take questions.
You said your opening remarks was to call, no doubt, that horrible collusion took place. An interview for RTE Prime Time in May of last year. You said you had no doubt below in the sky suspected of being responsible for Dublin and Malta bombings. Yet today's report says there's no evidence of collusion on the part of the British state in the 1974 atrocity. Some might see those statements as contradictory. Have you changed or refined your view of collusion?
No, not at all. My comments at the time related to the overarching Operation Denton, that collusion was well established, that it was undeniable it had occurred. Some of it was already on public record. My comments were not specific at that time to the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, and as John has outlined, through very, very rigorous investigation and review, and indeed obtaining a lot of material and assistance from a number of the pressure groups and organisations who have demanded answers, we have actually determined that it was the Belfast UBF, as been outlined. So my comments at the time related to Denton as a whole and the work that we were carrying out. And what I said then and what I've said this morning are entirely consistent.
Just to be clear, you're saying absolutely no evidence of British state collusion, but you're still saying there was collusion at individual level with the members of that group?
We haven't seen any evidence of collusion in regard to the Dublin and Monaghan attacks. But I also outlined in the final report that we do recognise there are quite significant gaps in the intelligence picture in regard to time and in regard to specific incidents such as the bombs and where they were made and who was responsible for that. So at all times we report on what we've found, but also at times we say we haven't been able to find answers. We are being crystal clear on that. And again, throughout this report, not just in Denton, I think the fact that the gaps that have existed and the lack of information has been problematic. But in regard to what we've seen, we haven't seen any state collusion in regard to the attacks in Dublin and Monaghan. And again, we've told the families who've suffered from that, we've spent time with them and we've explained our findings in some detail. You will appreciate that we are still subject to an ongoing and live judicial review in regard to Operation Denton. So unfortunately, I'm limited in terms of some of the specifics that I'd be able to share this morning, but I can absolutely clarify that.
Irish Times. Constable, said today that you believe intelligence was withheld, not because of security concerns, because they wanted to protect agents. And you said that you believe there's a culture of secrecy. Do you believe there still exists a culture of secrecy given the events of last year and MI5 given the files? And separately, Sir Iain, you mentioned in the report the 2000 events linked to Stakelknife. Do you know how many deaths could have been prevented had the authorities and the government acted on the relevant information?
If I go first on the culture of secrecy, I think that's something that we don't turn around overnight. Because of people in this room and the families that I've met, and the education I've had about the awareness that they've not been given even uncontroversial information, has helped me in the decisions I'm taking as Chief Constable to change that. But I need a shared endeavour, and the very nature of the fact that the government have decided still not to name Stakeknife, I think reflects that we still have some distance to go, but we will continue to knock on the door. We will continue to challenge this and set out the common sense approach here. Within my own organisation, we have changed our approach to matters of disclosure. We're about to publish a public interest immunity policy, which will set out how we deal with sensitive information. That hasn't been done before. And all of that, and the changes that we've been making, some of the descriptions I made in my concluding remarks about how families now feel, is because we've been listening to their experiences. So are we where I want us to be yet? No, we're not. Do we have proper funding and mechanisms to deal with legacy through the coronial process around disclosure in a timely way, the civil process for legacy cases in a timely way? No, we do not. But we are making strides to change that.
Thanks. You can see in the final report that Kenova felt that there was certainly a statable evidential case in regard to Stakeknife's activity for a number of murders, double figures. The contrary view, often presented by some, is that Stakeknife also saved a number of people. It's very, very difficult to assess what interventions, if any, or what information provided by Stakeknife actually had some impact on saving lives. And we have focused on evidence. We've actually focused on what we feel can be established. Now, we recognise, and we've included that in the final report, that it's entirely a matter for the DPP and the PPSNI to take a view on the evidential threshold for prosecution. Our role is to provide as much information and evidence as we can, and we felt that we had reported good cases, but clearly the prosecutorial perspective on that was different, and they are utterly entitled and rightly so to have that independent view. So an assessment on either deaths that could have been prevented had information been received, or those who at times advocate that Stakeknife was of value, an assessment of the number of deaths that Stakeknife may have been prevented is almost impossible to carry out with any level of rigour that I could publicly speak to. And again, I know that must be deeply frustrating, but we can report on matters that we feel that we can tie deaths and murders and grotesque serious criminality that we consider Stakeknife was involved in.
The report states that the Kenova relationship with MI5 was extremely fractious, and unless you point to a hard-fought uphill battle to try and get disclosure, among the examples of that are the reclassification of documents as top secret, the orthodox giving of disclosure to state-funded solicitors representing security force personnel, among other things. This isn't policing in the past, this is the current relationship between MI5, the Kenova team and policing. Is there going to be any accountability for that or any learning from that? I mean, this is not things that happened in the 70s or 80s, this is the activities of MI5 now in dealing with the Kenova team.
I'll take that, Alison, first, if I may. So, listen, what we've done in this report is set out publicly the experience of the Kenova team. In the original or the interim Kenova report, I also set out the experiences of others conducting legacy investigations, such as Lord Stevens, the Corey inquiry, the Smithick review, and indeed the experiences of those who are running the HEP. This has been a widespread challenge in getting information. There is a remaining challenge with MI5 and their approach, I believe, in Northern Ireland to legacy. And this report is part of making the case to change that and to call it out. And I absolutely agree with you about the accountability challenge. I welcome scrutiny, independent scrutiny. I say sunlight is the best disinfectant. How can we actually make sure we've learned the lessons of the past if we hide the issues that occurred behind some high stone wall. So the challenges have continued. I'm hoping that these reports, the commentary that will come from today, will all be part of getting to a position where things actually change. And they do need to change. Because this is impacting trust and confidence in policing today because of decisions made in Whitehall. And that is not acceptable.
Good afternoon. A question to each of you. Mr. Boutcher, how hard did you fight the government when it came to wanting to name Freddie Scappaticci as a Stakeknife? You're a man of action. You're not tempted to simply go for it. And Sir Iain, do you consider that MI5 attempted to cover up the full truth of the agent Stakeknife in the here and now, in the present day, as much as the past?
So, from the very beginning, almost the very beginning of this, I've made it very clear to officials, all of the security agencies, and secretaries of state, that there's an inevitable trajectory that Stakelknife is going to have to be named for the purposes of public confidence and also the accountability of what the individual's been involved in. I will continue to do that, and I've set out today in my remarks the correct and accurate position of the Kenova investigation. I have made personal representations to the Secretary of State about this, and I know he released a statement in advance of the publication of the report. And there is an intention to wait for the Thompson judgment, which effectively many interpret as setting me against the UK government around gisting, which is given limited information to families about why inquests couldn't continue. So let's hope that when that judgment comes out, and with the outworkings of Sir Iain's report and the commentary that will come from it, that they all may seek to change the mind of the Secretary of State and government about the naming of Stakeknife. Because in my view, it's doing far more harm on every level, on every interpretation, than it is doing any good that is assessed by those in the intelligence agencies who insist on it remaining in place. It is becoming pantomime, and it needs to be dealt with. And I will not give up on this, and I'm sure the families will not give up on this. So please be assured, I always do what I believe is right. I'm respecting, by the way, the due process that it should be for the Ministry of Defence and the Secretary of State to agree that Stakeknife can be identified. That's the sort of due process, by the way, that lots of these agents who were killed probably expected those cases to be investigated, and they were not, or for information to be passed that would have stopped them from coming to harm or being killed, but it was not. So there's a real irony in all of this, and I just hope, somebody at the beginning of this press conference said they couldn't hear me. Well, I really hope people in Westminster can hear me.
In regard to MI5, at an organisational level, no, I don't think that is the case. I spoke personally. Both John and I actually had a one-to-one, the two of us, with the Director General, 2-to-1, whenever this material arose. And I have no doubt that he was aghast, embarrassed, and took the matter extremely seriously. And again, I think whenever it came to light, he then did allocate resources to ensure that the material was revealed. Do I have reservations about some operatives within MI5 who culturally, as John's already alluded to, would not like the light to be shone, would not like that level of scrutiny? Yes, I do. And that's why we've narrated some of the problems and obstacles that arose. That was human behaviour within MI5. But MI5, I think, is clearly, using that cliche, on a journey in terms of accountability. The visibility, the public visibility of the Director General is night and day from when John and I started our careers. I think the public expectation around state bodies to be accountable, to answer to the public who we serve, and ultimately, in my view, whom we take our legitimacy from, and that would include MI5 as it does policing, there has to be that level of accountability. So at an organisational level from leadership, no, there wasn't and isn't an obstacle to that. Are there issues within the service because the people are protecting the past, perhaps through some misguided loyalty to previous colleagues or to some sense that they were always doing the right thing? Yes, I think that did arise, and that gave us a number of the difficulties that are outlined in the report. And that's why we've been as candid as we have. But I do think that the current Director General recognised that, and again, he knows that the level of accountability and scrutiny isn't going to diminish, it's only going to increase.
Stephen Murphy from Sky News. You've both spoken at length this morning about state failures and the damage that caused, and you're both urging the UK government to name, finally, Stakeknife and to reveal his identity. Is that enough? Shouldn't you be really urging the UK government and the Prime Minister to issue a full apology for the actions and the harm caused by Stakeknife, and more pertinently, his handlers within the security forces? Shouldn't there be a state apology for state failures?
Well, can I just say, and then I'm sure John will add to this, yes, and that was one of the recommendations in the interim report. I update on that, and that it hasn't progressed. There's been various reasons for that, and levels of delay, or some might say procrastination. But absolutely, we haven't specifically mentioned that in our opening remarks this morning. But we absolutely feel there should be an apology, just exactly as you outlined.
Can you see it progressing now that finally this report has been issued, that your work here is complete? Can you see Keir Starmer issuing such an apology?
I'll speak from. I hope so. That's why we are speaking and with such candour. As I said at the outset, neither John nor I are constitutional vandals. We're not here to throw the UK Constitution or key agencies, under a bus, to use a current phrase. We respect that. We're part of that. We're part of that infrastructure of British policing over many, many years. But we think, in terms of legitimacy, and John alluded to the Hillsborough report, that it's important to recognise when mistakes have been made, when there's been malfeasance. Because how can you gain confidence to go forward and improve matters? So that was one of the essential recommendations that was included in John's interim report. And it hasn't progressed, but it should. John?
So I have a very strong position that should happen. I was very clear in March last year. And the response from previous Secretary of State was because of ongoing legal matters that couldn't happen. Well, I'm afraid I think that's utter nonsense. When you've had previous apologies, David Cameron's comes to mind with regards to Blue Sunday, there was ongoing legal matters. We all know there's always ongoing legal matters. This is Northern Ireland. Just do the right thing. Do the right thing. It will assist incredibly with efforts that the government have to deal with legacy in the future. If they could accept the recommendations in the report, apologise where an apology is justified, and here it is justified, and identify the agent Stakeknife. These are basic things, and there's lots of warm words about commitment to legacy and legacy families. Well, those warm words have to stand up to actions, and that's what I think both Sir Iain and I are asking for today.
Prosecution
Yeah, if I can go first, then I'll hand to Sir Iain. So I don't accept that at all. I think the response to the interim report last year, the fact that you're all here today, the pushing that we're doing to change the weather on legacy and how things are dealt with, the responses I get almost every day from victims and families, because we've come to know what they went through and endured and given them information that they've never had. And I think we're talking probably in the region of 220 families who lost loved ones, never mind other serious offences of people who were badly injured or tortured. I don't accept that at all. I think this report is probably incredibly frustrating to the protectionists. The approach of Kenova is probably incredibly frustrating to government lawyers who are trying to stop disclosure, not increase it. So Iain used the word journey. Nothing's going to happen overnight, but I genuinely believe we've given a number of these victims a voice. We've applied the law as it should be applied, as it would be applied in London or Edinburgh or Cardiff. It should apply the same way in Belfast and in Northern Ireland. And I think we are making headway with regards to how legacy is dealt with. And I genuinely believe, although the bill that created the ICRIR was not a bill that I supported, it begrudgingly had to accept some of the frameworks that Kenova put in place. And the latest primary legislation is again progress towards an Operation Kenova type model. Still not there, but it's progress. So we have prosecutions because there's 3 bereaved police officers' families probably watching this who'll be shouting at the screen. Well, we can't prosecute a dead man. Well, we can't prosecute a dead man. And if you look at the report, the information in the report is considerable about the material that was given to the Public Prosecution Service. It's probably...
You're talking about the destruction of the report.
Take you from Belfast to the House of Commons for an urgent question on Operation Kenova from the DUP leader, Gavin Robinson.
And the government's response to its findings.
Stay. I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for his question, and I want to inform the House that I will be laying a written ministerial statement on this matter later today. Operation Kenova has published its final report, which covers the activities of the alleged agent Stakeknife, as well as other investigations referred to it by the PSNI. I want to begin by commending the Kenova team, led by Sir Iain Livingstone and John Boutcher, for the exemplary way they carried out their work, built trust with families, put victims first, and provided many answers about what happened to their loved ones. Operation Terma, which was part of Kenova, resulted in the prosecution of an individual now extradited from Ireland and awaiting trial for the murder of 3 RUC officers in 1982. Kenova has set a standard for future legacy investigations, and we've drawn on a number of those lessons in drafting the Troubles Bill. I wish to express my heartfelt condolences to all the families who lost loved ones in the appalling circumstances described in this sobering report. Operation Kenova was asked to establish whether there was evidence of criminal offences by the alleged agent known as Stakeknife or their alleged handlers. The behaviour described of the alleged agent and their role in the provisional IRA is deeply disturbing. It should not have happened. And in recent decades, there have been significant reforms to agent handling practice, including through legislation. The use of agents is nowadays subject to strict regulation, overseen by the Investigatory Powers Commissioner and the Investigatory Powers Tribunal. On Operation Kenova's request to the government to name Stakeknife, I told Sir Iain Livingstone in August that, and I quote, "Due to ongoing litigation relevant to the neither confirm nor deny policy, namely the Thompson Supreme Court appeal, a substantive and final response to your request will be provided after judgment has issued in that case." The government's first duty is, of course, to protect national security, and identifying agents risks jeopardising this. Today's report also makes public the high-level findings of Operation Denton, which looked at killings carried out by the UVF Glenanne gang. The behaviour reported on, including collusion by individual members of the security forces, is shocking. The government will respond to the full Denton report when it is published, bearing in mind that there are related legal proceedings ongoing in this case and in the case of Stakeknife. The government responded to a number of the other recommendations in the interim Kenova report in August. This is available in the library and is also addressed in the written ministerial statement.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Secretary of State for that response and for being here this afternoon, to discuss Operation Kenova. I know that when the Secretary of State was appointed, he has spent an inordinate amount of time on legacy, and I know that he is committed to the principles of not rewriting the past and of ensuring that issues can be explored to the fullest degree. He knows that in Northern Ireland, peace was only secured because of the actions of our intelligence services, our armed forces and brave members of the RUC. He knows that the IRA were brought to their knees by the activities of our intelligence services. And he also knows that the IRA were riven by agents of the state. Both Dennis Donaldson, the Director of Operations for Sinn Féin, and Freddie Scappaticci, the Head of the Internal Investigations Unit, also known as Stakeknife. Can I ask the Secretary of State, does he welcome the finding of Operation Kenova that there was no high-level state collusion between paramilitaries, loyalist paramilitaries, and members of the army or the security forces? Does he recognise the important role that our intelligence services did play in securing peace in Northern Ireland? Does he recognise that the IRA were riven by informers? Does he realise the absurdity of maintaining the position that Operation Kenova could not name Freddie Scappaticci as Stakeknife? Does he recognise, in the findings relating to the Dublin and Monaghan bombings, that the UK state authorities had no information or intelligence that could have prevented those bombings? And does he recognise, in the context of the debate we are having on legacy, that there are too many inquiries he is letting pass by without highlighting the lack of accountability on the Dublin government, on the Republic of Ireland and their role in supporting the IRA? And we cannot wait until the conclusion of his legislative process or inquiry after inquiry until they open their books, share their stories and indicate in the basis of truth and justice the role they played in our troubled past.
To the right honourable gentleman for those points, and I join him in recognising the huge contribution that was made by the intelligence services and by the Army and by the IUC and other security forces during the Troubles to try and keep people safe and to defeat those who were trying to destroy society as a result of their terrorism. And we all recognise that. And the responsibility for the killing of around 1,700 people, the murder, often in the most brutal circumstances, and in some cases killing people, burying them, and then for a long time providing no information as to where the remains of people's loved ones were to be found, rests with the Provisional IRA. And I echo the comments that were made in the interim report and in the final report about what they did. I note, of course, what the report has to say in not finding any evidence of high-level collusion between the security forces and loyalist paramilitaries, in particular the UVF, in respect of the work of the Glenanne gang, as they have been called. But I do notice what they said about individual collusion. And I use the word shocking deliberately because to learn now that serving police officers, so Operation Kenova reports, and serving members of the armed forces were colluding with those who were murdering people, a very large number of people, over 120 people were murdered by that gang. On the final point that he raises about all of us wishing to learn from the past, and I think in order to learn from the past, one has to try and tell the truth about the past. I would simply draw his attention to the framework agreement reached between the UK government and the Irish government in September, the steps that have been taken, which he and I have debated many times before, by the Irish government to cooperate with the OMA inquiry, and the commitment that they have given to the fullest possible cooperation with a reformed legacy commission, which the government's Troubles Bill is seeking to put in place with the consent and will of the House. And I hope that all members would welcome that, because the more information we can get about what happened, the more families will be able to find out exactly what took place in respect of their loved ones.
Chair of the committee, Tony Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my committee's report on legacy outlined last week, information disclosure has been and remains one of the biggest challenges with legacy investigations. The Kenova report outlines the failure of MI5 to disclose all relevant material pertaining to Stakeknife in a timely manner. The PSNI Chief Constable said today he remains concerned there continues to be an unhelpful, unnecessary and protectionist approach to the disclosure of official records. Given these comments, Mr. Speaker, and the significant concerns outlined in our report on the government's new approach to disclosure, how can families have confidence in the new process?
Well, I'm very grateful to the chair of the Select Committee for what she has just said. She refers to the unfortunate episode in which MI5 discovered further files relating to the work of Operation Kenova, which they hadn't been able to identify previously. The Kenova report does say that they have no reason to believe that those reports, those files were withheld. It was, MI5 was not able to find them, and the head of MI5 set up a process to review exactly what had occurred. I think it is essential that all of us are able to say that when the bodies that are charged with investigating what happened in the past, and that includes the current ICRAR, which will become the Legacy Commission under our legislation, it is the case under the current Legacy Act that the ICRAR has the ability to request and to see all information, and that will remain the case when it comes to the reformed Legacy Commission, because the Commission has the ability to deal with closed material. The coronial system does not, as the House is aware, and it is vital, precisely as she puts it, for the confidence of families that they know that the people who are trying to find out what happened to their loved ones are able to see all of the relevant material.
Shadow Secretary of State.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for granting this urgent question. And I congratulate my honourable friend from Belfast East for asking it and for his excellent contribution just now. This is a very significant and highly detailed report, which I know honourable members will want to take some time to digest. But this side of the House would like to thank all those who've contributed to it, and also to remember all of those who suffered during that very, very difficult time. The last Conservative government apologised for collusion following the De Silva review into the murder of Patrick Finucane. And whilst it is sobering to read further accounts of collusions between a small number of agents of the British state and paramilitaries, it is important to set this alongside a number of findings in the report today. First is the understanding, as mentioned by the Secretary of State, that legislation has changed dramatically since the time in question, under the last Labour government, but also under the last Conservative government. Second, it's important to highlight that although the review found that there were a small number of rogue actors, they did not find, and I quote, any evidence that collusion occurred at a political or strategic level. and that there was no evidence which indicates that the RUC at an organisational level was involved or complicit with the activities of extremists or terrorists. I think it's very important that those findings are not lost. Third, as my honourable friend from Belfast East said, the review found that of the 1974 Dublin and Monaghan bombings, there was no specific intelligence which, if acted upon, could have prevented those bombings. And it did not manage to find any evidence that there was intelligence that would indicate that British security forces were colluding with the UVF in those attacks. But again, historic findings, I think, today. I'd be very interested to hear from the Secretary of State if he would be prepared to come back at a later date and tell us more about the government's future position on neither confirm nor deny. I understand that there's a case going on at the moment, but I believe that once that's done, it would be very important for the government to be clear with the House about how it sees that policy going forward. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, as has already been raised, there have been a number of reviews, detailed reviews and necessary reviews into collusion between agents of the British state and paramilitaries.
It's 1 o'clock. You're watching Sky News. We're getting political reaction to this report, which has just been published on an IRA spy. Stay tuned to Sky News.
Well, I am grateful to the honourable gentleman for his comments and the spirit and tone in which he delivers them on this extremely serious matter. I do indeed acknowledge, as I think I've already indicated, what he said about the nature of the collusion that has been discovered, what it was and what it was not, including in relation to the Dublin Monaghan bombings. Those are very, very important findings. It is for the Irish government to determine what information they reveal, but they have given commitments to me and to the UK government, and indeed to all of us, about the cooperation that they will provide. The Taoiseach has said to me that by March, the legislation to allow witness testimony to be given to the Omagh bombing inquiry will be in place, and we look forward to seeing in due course the outline of the Irish government legislation that will implement the rest of the commitments when it comes to cooperation with the new Legacy Commission, which we are seeking to establish by means of the legislation currently before the House. I am always happy to return to the House to provide further information and to answer further questions. But we are waiting for the Thompson judgment, which is absolutely about the neither confirm nor deny policy, which is why when I wrote to Sir Iain Livingstone on I think it was the 13th of August, I said to him what I quoted in my original answer to the right honourable gentleman's question.
I
think it's important, Mr. Speaker, to firstly say that the people responsible for the murder of innocent people in Northern Ireland over many decades were the people who carried out those murders and the organisations that they were members of. But it is also very clear, Mr. Speaker, through these reports and previous investigations, that elements within the British state worked hand in glove with loyalist paramilitaries as they murdered scores and hundreds of innocent people in the north of Ireland, and also that the IRA were riddled with informers, including, clearly, at the very highest levels. So now that we know all of that, Mr. Speaker, has the Secretary of State made an assessment of how many lives could have been saved and how much earlier could we have had peace in Ireland if the British government had acted properly?
Well, we're going to step away from the House of Commons now and that political reaction to this report to some news about who was going to be the chair of another report, the Government Grooming Gangs Inquiry. Let's talk to our home editor, Jason Farrell, who can tell us more. Jason, so who's it to be?
My understanding is that it's going to be Anne Longfield, who's the former Children's Commissioner. We're waiting for a formal announcement from Shabana Mahmood, who is going to stand up in the Commons at 15:15 and talk about this.
Giving them as much information as we possibly can.
I mean, I actually feel duty-bound to report on the experiences that Kenova have had to try to make the Legacy Commission as robust and effective as it can be. And that's for all sections of society and all individuals. And like John, you know, my regard and respect for people who are operating in the security services to uphold the rule of law during the Troubles is of the highest. And again, that's why I made those comments when I started this morning.
Ready?
Nice dip. One of the longer ones, I haven't had a request for a renewal, so I'm not going to.
At all, I think you've got everything you ever need.
Yeah, I don't think a 101 would be better. So, I just literally asked him, are you still planning on doing it immediately? And he said, yeah. It's
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I've got two hats on today. PFC hat and advisor of Chief Allies hat. And also student journalism.
Okay, sorry about the delay. Thanks very much for coming. This is a press conference on behalf of the families of the Stakeknife victims. We represent over 22 families and other victims and survivors of what we would call the Stakeknife project. And we have a prepared statement which I think has been released to all media sources. So if I may just outline it to you. So the publication of today's final Kenova report into what I would call the Stakeknife project marks the end of 7 years' work and over £40 million spent on an investigation by over 60 detectives. However, today is not the end of what at times has been a very fraught and anxiety-laden journey for the next of kin of those murdered by the Internal Security Unit of the IRA. They were murdered as suspect touts or informants. Today's Kenova report does not bookend things for these families. Rather, it points the way forward to getting more answers and opens up doors on many other unresolved issues, not the least of which is the one that is staring everyone in the face this afternoon, i.e., that is, the failure to name Freddie Scappaticci as the agent Stakeknife. I can cut to the chase right now and formally announce that Freddie Scappaticci was the agent Stakeknife. In saying that, he wasn't the only Stakeknife in the drawer of steak knives. As originally somewhat discreetly alluded to, in the interim Kenova report from March last year, there were other agents operating either inside the internal security unit or otherwise linked to it. Today's report brings additional confirmation of that. And I think it's important to record that the Kenova team have fought very, very hard to name Stakeknife, and we've seen evidence of that this morning. And that has been a fight in the face of the impenetrable state intelligence obstacle known as NCND, which is the concept, the policy of neither confirm nor deny when it comes to matters of state intelligence. I think it's important to observe that NCND is not enshrined in any piece of legislation. Rather, it is a government-driven policy which serves to protect matters of national security at all costs. And it's a matter of deep regret and frustration that we don't have a departure from that policy to allow the formal naming of Stakeknife. It's extremely insulting to the families who've invested so much time and faith and effort in the Kenova investigation. It's a slap in the face by the state at a time when there ought to be the most fulsome of apologies over what was a state-sponsored murder operation lasting 15 years from 1979 to 1994. Today's report provides us with additional ballast to support our ongoing High Court challenge to set aside NCND. The family and next of kin of Para ISU murder victim Anthony McKernan are in the later stages of a judicial review challenge to force a departure by the state on NCND. On the back of today's very strong commentary by the Chief Constable and Iain Livingstone, we now call upon the government to drop its incessant use of NCND to block tackle families from getting this confirmation. It's a disgrace that after all this time and so much money spent, that the Secretary of State and the government are hell-bent on preventing this. It's both farcical and deeply insensitive to those families who've engaged, especially when, to quote from the report, the dogs in the street know exactly who Stakeknife is. Equally reprehensible is the ban on releasing details of Fred Scappaticci's probate and will details. That's to be kept secret for 70 years. It's nothing short of insulting to the families. NCND has been used on an industrial scale as a bulwark to prevent the truth about the role of state complicity in murder, and it's to keep prying eyes away from its toxic role in murder conspiracies. And one has to ask, at what stage will there ever be anything approaching meaningful accountability? At the end of the day, Fred Scappaticci is dead, and so is his wife. Any residual Article 2 right to life issues is very much moot and completely redundant. He needs called out now as Stakeknife. If I may talk briefly about the role of MI5 arising from today's report. At paragraph 12.5, I think, in the report, we learn that an MI5 operative broke into a locker belonging to 2 Kenova personnel in Thames House. What does that say about the integrity of the process? It harks back to the fires started at the offices of the Stevens Inquiry when in the 1990s Sir John Stevens and his team started investigating loyalist state collusion into the killing of Pat Finucane and many others. Equally underwhelming is the stark statistic that despite a lorry load of evidence and the submission of many files, there have been no prosecutions whatsoever after all this time. It beggars belief that we don't have anyone in the dock in a criminal court. This failure has to rank right up there with the failure to name Stakeknife. Irrespective of the failure to prosecute or not, I think it is important to put on record at this point that Kenova remains a vital piece of investigative work that ought to stand the test of time. But it's extremely frustrating that after all this time, we don't have one single prosecution of anyone. The feedback received from most families is directed mostly at the failure to charge handlers and other security force personnel with anything. Many next of kin know exactly who pulled triggers and who took people away to be interrogated and executed. What they really wanted to see was the handlers and overseers of state-sponsored murder in the dock.
That hasn't happened. However, we shouldn't judge Kenova's legacy through the prism of a failure to prosecute anyone. PPS failures on directions to prosecute shouldn't be determinative as to whether or not Kenova is deemed a success or a failure. I think it's important to note that both the interim report and today's final Kenova report will provide much needed support for further judicial intrusion and oversight into all PPS decision making to date. The family of Anthony Braniff, who I'm very pleased to see are here today, are challenging the failure of the PPS to prosecute state agencies over health and safety regulations on the handling and oversight of intelligence and intelligence assets. And a judgment is expected very soon, which hopefully will change the narrow prosecution decision-making processes which only serve to make it more difficult to prosecute. Today's report will help their fight. We're also challenging the PPS over the failure to issue a public statement on the decision on not prosecuting a separate agent in a high-profile murder from the late 1980s. This separate agent, other than Freddie Scappaticci, made admissions to security force personnel about his involvement in that murder, yet he's not prosecuted, nor is there a public statement from the PPS about it, and one wonders why and why that is the case. Again, it's significant that we're not talking about Freddie Scappaticci here. The evolving dividend of Kenova is that it serves to provide clues if you look hard enough and know where to look. We've been able to join the dots and work out the existence of another high-profile agent. It will come as little comfort to families this morning to learn that this agent is alive and well, living in England, protected and paid for at taxpayers' expense. I seriously considered naming him this morning, and if nothing else, to serve as an antidote to the state intelligence clampdown that we've seen this morning, articulated so clearly. But the need for compliance with professional and other legal obligations on my part has served to stop me doing that. Rather, we leave it to the courts to adjudicate. But it was a close-run decision for me. The need for recourse to the courts underpins the level of frustration and highlights the recurring problem of the state failing to be proactive and transparent. Instead, it purports to be reactive and opaque on everything intelligence-related. A further case is that of Thomas Emmanuel Wilson, whose son is sitting beside me here today. He was murdered in 1987, and the failure to issue proper reasons for not prosecuting Freddie Scappaticci and security force personnel on charges of perjury back in 2006 forms the centrepiece of Paul's family's case. New revelations by the journalist John Ware, which turned a hitherto previously settled narrative on perjury on this issue.
Cutting from that family press conference to the Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, in the Commons.
Inquiry's terms of reference. I know that, for many, this day is long overdue. For years, the victims of these awful crimes were ignored. First abused by vile predators, they then found themselves belittled and even blamed when it was justice they were owed. In January, my predecessor asked Baroness Casey of Blackstock, who's here with us today, to conduct a national audit on group-based child sexual exploitation and abuse. With devastating clarity, Baroness Casey revealed the horror that lies behind that jargonistic term. It is vital that we too call these crimes what they were: multiple sexual assaults committed by multiple men on multiple occasions. Children were submitted to beatings and gang rapes. Many contracted sexually transmitted infections. Some were forced to have abortions. Others had their children taken from them. But it was not just these awful crimes that now shame us. There was also an abject failure by the state in its many forms to fulfil its
and John Boutcher has been very critical of the length of time it's taken to make those decisions. Families may indeed be forgiven for having a perception that the PPS are some sort of Praetorian Guard of MI5 state intelligence. It's a view that's hard to resist when you stand back and look at the systemic pattern of prosecutorial shutdown on nearly every single issue and strand of the Stakeknife saga. The courts have suggested to us that we should look at IC or IR as an option, but that really doesn't cut much ice when you see how the Secretary of State has vetoed NCND in the Stakeknife cases. What hope is there if the Chief Constable and the former head of Police Scotland can't get NCD over the line? How can we then urge families to invest trust and confidence in an entity which is subject to the very same strictures on NCND departure as that highlighted this morning? It just doesn't make sense. For us, Kenova has opened up a Pandora's box on MI5 security service oversight and control over life and death during the conflict. Any suggestion of that entity existing as some sort of distant, honest broker in the labyrinthine world of intelligence and agent handling is well and truly consigned to history when you stand back and look at the legacy of Kenova. We can really see the ugly reality for what it is. To that end, when you look at the same systemic failings in the case of Brian Nelson, it's really a case of déjà vu. The same mantra where between the two sets of investigations over many years, we still end up with no prosecutions is a hard statistic to absorb. However, there's one major difference. In Kenova, we now have a detailed report together with bespoke family reports, all imparting the sort of detail which was never in a million years going to be made available to these next of kin. Such revelations are in stark contrast to the paucity of information given to the many victims' families of state-sponsored UDA Brian Nelson killings spanning a similar era in the conflict. The Chief Constable is on record making it clear that Stevens 3 needs to be published because much of the suppressed investigative product in that is of broadly similar nature to that which we've learned about last March and again today. There's absolutely no rhyme or reason why Stevens 3 so-called secrets can't be released into the public domain in a manner similar to that which we've learned this morning and back in March. Frustratingly, in the continued delay in departing from NCND, we have no alternative but to resort yet again to the courts. An important outworking of Kenova has seen its work point to the sheer extent of state complicity in a collusive murder across other sectors and eras of the conflict. We need to guard against any disproportionate focus on para-ISU to the exclusion of so many other state killings. There's a real danger that we look at the Stakeknife project as somehow representing the apex of state-sponsored murder of its citizens. It wasn't. Rather, to my mind, it was but a mere sliver of a much wider systemic intelligence malaise that served repeatedly to expose so many people to murder or other risk to life during the conflict. A note on the legacy of Kenova, and a final word on the families of the victims of the Stakeknife issue. In some ways, not an awful lot has changed for them when you look at it from outside the box. However, and firstly, I'm pleased to see so many of them here today. That has to be progress. Given the absence of any families at the reading of the interim Kenova report last year, that is a major development and is hugely important and significant in terms of optics, that they feel now that they can come into a room here today and hold their heads high. For far too long, those families have been confined to the back streets of their communities. For me, one of the key takeaway legacies is their emergence from the shadows to be able to make themselves heard and felt and seen. The stigma of the tout or informant still runs deep in Irish history. In the aftermath of today's report, I'd like to think that suffocating stigma has now subsided. Not completely, but just enough to allow a reasonable number of families to hold their heads high, knowing that the truth or a substantial part of it has emerged to help change the narrative on their lives. Last March, when the interim Kenova report was released, I sat in that room without a single person present, and today is a major change. Next of kin can no longer feel that they have to hide or see people walk on the other side of the street to avoid their eyes. There may still be no throngs of placard waving campaigners to greet them today, but there is a sea change I detect in the face of residual political constipation over what happened here. The deafening silence over their plight has been shifted. In the process of demystifying a lot of the conspiracy theories around Stakeknife, Kenova has also helped destigmatise the lives of many affected families. I think it's important as well to record that many internal security unit victims were not actually touts, and that they were, if they did become compromised, that was on the back of serious threats by the state. They were pressurised and compromised by the state as a starting point. The state started the process of putting lives at risk and then bookended the whole macabre engagement by having its own state agents used in those persons' murders. There was a criminal dysfunctionality underpinning what was otherwise seen as normal intelligence policing. This is just how it was done then. That's the excuse that's given, and it no longer cuts it. People were allowed simply to die as part of a drive to prioritise intelligence maintenance over the investigation of crime. CID murder investigators operated at times on starvation rations of evidence and intelligence, drip-fed by special branch and FRU operatives, in turn who were directed from upon high by Whitehall and elsewhere. Freddie Scappaticci provided over 3,300 items of intelligence to the authorities. That industrial-scale provision of information saved pitifully few lives, and one has to wonder why. However, only this time, I think MI5 have been badly caught out in a manner that probably hasn't ever really happened before. We need to revisit the review findings of Baroness Hall on exactly why and how did MI5 fail to deliver Stevens 3 intelligence, which was in existence 15 years previously. They simply didn't cooperate with Kenova at all, and that needs to be revisited, as has been highlighted here this morning. All of this points, in my view, to perverting the course of justice, given that it was conveniently kept away from Kenova and released simply 3 weeks after the interim report was released and about 1 week before the Legacy Act came into force. That gave precious little time to get a complaint to the authorities. The MI5 operatives had no personal incentive to do this, as they'd retired, as I understand it, so why stick to a defensive choreography that ensured that the Stevens 3 investigative material didn't make its way to Kenova in time? It's farcical were it not so sensitive. When things got too hot, Stakeknife was moved away and flown out of the country and entertained at taxpayers' expense. People were sacrificed in order to preserve the intelligence agenda. The process of keeping him preserved was increasingly under strain as the pretence became ever more difficult to maintain, and as incidents from the late 1980s increasingly attracted suspicion on Scappaticci before finally falling apart in the aftermath of the Sandy Lynch affair in 1990. Earlier this year, we were in court to challenge the Secretary of State over his continuing refusal, to have a public inquiry into the 1994 Internal Security Unit murder of Caroline Morland, and indeed State ISU generally. We were advised by the Secretary of State to wait until the publication of today's report, and the court indeed endorsed that view and effectively told us that we had to wait when dismissing our judicial review application. Well, today I want to say to Hilary Benn that we're back. We've waited patiently since earlier this year for this moment to arrive. Today's report enables us to go straight back to the High Court to renew our call for a public inquiry into the Stakeknife project or the Stakeknife individual. For the reasons cited today, we simply can't go to ICRIR because of the national security veto on intelligence. A public inquiry is the only option to take today's Kenova work product to the next stage. Otherwise, it will all have been in vain. And a final word, if I may say, is to say thanks to John Boutcher and to Iain Livingstone and the investigating team of Kenova. They interfaced with families and they treated families with the sort of respect that was never given to them, and indeed the vast majority of conflict-related families have never had proper respect in dealing with investigative agencies throughout the conflict. The last number of years was an example of how it should be done, and I would urge families, and many families have differing views about the outworkings of this morning's and all the last number of years' work. Many families have got the sort of information which never in a million years they were going to access, and they have that now. There are some families regularly frustrated and annoyed, but I would really direct and suggest that they project their ire towards the other agencies. MI5, the PPS, the Secretary of State and the British government, collectively, they have let these people down, many of them who are here today, and I would say look to them as the reasons why there's anxieties and frustrations still in play. We're left with, as lawyers are for law, having to recourse to the courts, and there's so much information that's been made available through the interim report, the family bespoke reports and details of which have been handed out over the last 18 months, and today's findings, to allow us to have to litigate. But I keep emphasising it, we shouldn't have to litigate the answers, the details, the naming of Stakeknife, PPS decision making, and other information should all be readily available. So we use Kenova's investigative product to engage with the courts in a manner which will hopefully give additional closure. There is some closure for the families, there's not total closure. And you will hear from some of the family representatives today, and they'll give you their views and assessments of how they feel. You will hear frustrations, anxieties, and indeed levels of distress. You will hear them say about the level of information that they would never have got, but there's more that needs done. And I'll now refer to the families of Wilson and Simons, Moira Todd and Paul Wilson. Thank you.
Can I ask, I'm sorry, first of all, thanks for being here, and it's not easy to sit in front of all these cameras and people like me, but there was a discussion in the last report, and mentioned again today, about a state apology, and should that come now, would that in any way, do you think, help your families, and if not, what would you actually like to see happening next?
Well, certainly wouldn't help me, or our family. I just want somebody to take me into a room and tell me the truth. If they want to put a non-disclosure agreement to it, I'll sign that. I just want to know the truth. It's 45 years ago, almost to the day, since my brother was taken and tortured by Stakelknife. He was murdered thereafter. The authorities had all the details and did nothing. And 45 years on, I'm sitting here really none the wiser, and all I'm hearing is about the truth being suppressed and the government avoiding accountability, and it's just totally frustrating.
Sure. Can I also ask, in terms of MI5, there's clearly a practice relationship which was noted between the Kenova team and MI5. It also stated that it was an uphill battle and that information was withheld. Do you think that we have the full picture in terms of that intelligence picture, or do you believe that there's still information which is being withheld?
Absolutely not. We don't have the full picture. And I mean, the starting point for that answer is the fact, is what we've heard this morning. And you could sense the frustration of the Chief Constable and Sir Iain Livingstone when they give their discourse on this issue. We're not convinced that the Baroness Hall review has had all the answers. This report, and what we now know from other sectors, we say there needs to be a revisitation of her findings. And I think what you clearly saw today, and it's the first time in my career I've ever seen anything like it, where a senior police officers call out MI5 over their handling of intelligence issues. That's never happened before. Whether it'll happen again, I don't know. But it was called out loudly and clearly here this morning in a way that was unique. And I think that's important. It shows the independence of the policing agencies from the state. But there is a fractious interfacing with MI5 and the intelligence agencies, and that absolutely needs to be called out. It's a major start in terms of the report and what we've heard this morning, but there needs to be more done. And at this stage, in the absence of anything else, and as I've said earlier, I don't see ICRIR as providing the route for this. I think we'll have to go back to the courts. Again, as so many families have had to do. And I mean, one of the other significant reports today, the Denton report, was born out of litigation in the Barnard review. Denton became in existence as a result of Barnard through the courts. So I've alluded to separate sets of litigation before the High Court arising out of the interim Kenova report, and I envisage further litigation on that very key issue.
Paul, what difference will it make to you if Freddie Scappaticci is named in the file? was your sense of coming away from today and just after a very long press conference? I'm sure it's overwhelming at times.
Well, we knew going in that he wasn't being named, so that. But the whole point of Kenova from the start was you'll get the truth. How can you say we're getting any truth if that key detail is missing? There's always other stuff that's missing because of national security, which you have to sort of accept to a certain degree, but that's a basic thing. You can't investigate the agent or the Stakeknife, spend all that money, and then not find out who he is. That seems like a give it on go.
And do you have anything in terms of your relationship and involvement with the Kenova investigators? Have there been any positives for you?
Kenova,
family to family.
Kenova have been excellent with our family, and I'm assuming most families would have no problem with the Kenova team. It's always that feeling that Kenova are doing the investigation, but it never feels like they're in complete control of the investigation. It always feels like there's roadblocks, there's turning points, and whenever they're getting so far, it's like, nope, no more, stop. And then we're left to pick up the pieces, or you can't pick up the pieces because you're not allowed to see the pieces.
So just finally, do you know if your father's death had been prevented?
On the family report, it couldn't have been, but after his death, the people that committed the murder, the information's been there from 1987. They didn't act on it.
Paul, can I ask, what did you learn, maybe for the first time, about your father's death, the Operation Kenova?
Well, because in 1987 there was no investigation. Actually, even Kenova reported that 6 days later the police service just stopped investigating. So we learned everything through Kenova, everything. Obviously we'd always heard bits and pieces, Belfast, information gets about, but the end all from Kenova was getting it first hand from the first ever police that took us seriously. That was great. But probably like many of the families in here, 90% just isn't enough. It's the last pieces that we need for this to be settled and put to bed so we can finally move forward. And what's the point in 90%? Why put us through all this ringer just to get so far and say enough's enough? You know, it is great that we got it, but we signed up for the whole truth, not what they want to tell us.
And can I ask you both, Paul and Moira, there were calls earlier for a British government apology to the families of Stakeknife victims. Would that mean anything to you? What would that mean to you?
I don't think it would mean anything to me unless you get all the whole truth. If they're going to come out and say sorry but still withhold key evidence and key information, then it's just a false apology and it means nothing. It's the information and the truth we want, not somebody's apology.
Yeah, I agree with Paul, but I'm also, with respect to all the families here, a lot of that press conference was taken up by the naming and the not naming of Stakeknife. And I'm afraid that that's going to take precedence. This, to my mind, is a sort of smokescreen. People will concentrate on this. It's what's behind it we want to know. It's what he did, how he was allowed to do it. And as Paul has already said, everybody knows who Scappaticci is. So let's just get on with, you know, finding out what he did, why he was allowed to do it, and how high, you know, how many in the British government, how far up the British government. Did it go to Margaret Thatcher? Did she approve anything? Those are the things we need to know.
Did you feel that you learned anything new about the father's murder?
What? Well, you have someone like me who really knows nothing. Eugene was taken away and murdered in 45 years ago. The word was put out that he was a tout, and this was a sort of internal IRA matter. And it really wasn't until Kenova came along and he was then connected with Stakeknife that any interest was taken in it. They started then being interested in it. I was just, the thing that shocked me most today with Kenova was how far the British government will go to hide, to cover up. I mean, releasing in 2024 that tranche of documents when it was all too late. It's just absolutely shocking and shows a total disregard for families, for the judicial process. It's just, it's hard to believe, you know, this is our government. You know, we're not a third world country. This is the British government doing this to its own citizens. It's shocking.
Or can I just ask, Kevin pointed at the start when he was reading about how there was no families here for the interim report, and there is, as you pointed out, your brother was promoted out, there was stigma around that. You're here now, very publicly speaking. How important did you think it was that you came here today to represent your brother's legacy?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely vital. Absolutely. You know, we need to know things like, was he a tout? Why they took him and buried him in a hole south of the border. He was in Castlereagh, I think, 4 times. No charges were ever made against him. He'd never been in court. The IRA didn't tell us where his body was. They knew from Stakeknife that within 11 days, they took him on the 1st of January, they murdered him on the 11th. So he had 11 days of probably unspeakable horror that the authorities knew about and totally ignored it. They knew he was dead. They didn't tell us. My father hunted high and low. My brother walked the streets of Dundalk, of Dublin, hoping to bump into him. And all the while the authorities knew that he wasn't coming back. He was gone.
That's the most hurtful what you just said.
Yeah.
They knew.
Yeah.
They knew. Yeah. They knew my husband was in somewhere down South Armagh getting tortured.
Yeah.
And yet, this has all come on and I really appreciate it. I hid for years. Hid because I believed my husband was an informer, believed he'd all the things that he'd done. I can't describe it, but I just had to live my life with that fear at the back of it. You know that they was talking about me.
Oh yeah, our family was spat at and abused.
Yeah, it just was that thing that you really, and you had to find out that the Brits knew.
Yeah.
But they knew couldn't see it. Like my husband was shot in the head, wrote me a beautiful love letter. And he knew he was going to be dead. He knew after that comment to his head, and that is the most horrendous, horrific thing that I've lived with, that he knew and left me having a baby in my belly to go through the birth where he's lying in a grave. I didn't really get emotional, but it is emotional. And I think I speak for most of the families. You know, the shame, the guilt, the trying to fit in, feeling that you're nobody, you're out there and you're doing things. Now I feel alive. And I'm not going to hide again. I am not going to hide. My husband was Johnny Dignam, and I don't care what anybody says about him in the past, what torture that he's put my children through. My husband was innocent.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No need to apologise.
So that's okay. That's exactly the type of thing that I was referring to in my earlier comments about families like yourself having the bravery to come forward and stick your head above the parapet. After all these years, it's been a difficult journey, so I commend you for your position today.
Unfortunately, my oldest son couldn't come.
Yeah.
And the rest is out of the country. So I've done it sort of on my own.
Yep.
In a way to protect them, but a mother always protects the children, you know. I was pumping now.
And John Boutcher talked in there about, you know, the IRA and what they did to their victims and how they tortured them, etc., etc. The British government and their agents were doing exactly the same. Exactly the same.
Moira.
And I mean, how many, I mean, it's a ridiculous thing to say, but at one stage, Was the actual IRA been run by British agents?
Yes.
Huh?
Yes.
How many British agents, were in the IRA directing traffic?
Moira, can I ask you, Paul, the Director General of MI5 has issued a statement today saying that he offers his sympathies on behalf of MI5 to the victims and families of those who were tortured or killed by the Provisional IRA's Internal Security Unit during the Troubles. Can I get your thoughts on that, please?
The ISU was run by one of their agents. And they're still covering up. Where's the truth? And they still will continue to try and stop the truth coming out. No, absolutely unacceptable for me.
I think, as Paul referred to, that apology would have so much more substance if there was a departure from this ridiculous NCND, and they're still purporting to keep that in place and offer the apology. The apology is completely hollow and irrelevant in my view. I mean, families can speak for themselves.
Yeah, you can't do what MI5 done for all these years during Kenova and come out and apologise because the final report's out. If you were really sorry, you would have helped the investigation from the start instead of dragging it out this long. It was only meant to last a few years. It went near 10, and that's because of MI5. Was he giving apologies when he was trying to take them to court to stop it? No, he wasn't. So he's just doing it now because it's in the media and it's a good soundbite for him to say it.
Yeah.
Okay, unless there's any other questions or any other issues.
Just one thing I would say.
Sorry, Mark.
There's no talk of compensation. It's up to each family to make their own decisions, but I hope that they don't intend to buy us off and then shut this up. Pardon? Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you.